Muy buenos días a todos y a todas, bienvenidas y gracias por conectarse. Este evento será en inglés y español y pueden acceder al canal de traducción abajo, mano derecha. Good morning, welcome and thanks for being here today. This seminar will be held both in Spanish and English, and you can access the translation channel below. Mi nombre es María Paz Hermosilla y soy directora del GovLab, Laboratorio de Innovación Pública de la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez en Chile, y hoy estaré presentando este segundo conversatorio del proyecto Algoritmos Éticos, Responsables y Transparentes que lideramos desde la universidad junto al BitLab, el Laboratorio de Innovación del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo. Estamos muy contentos porque para este encuentro nos hemos unido con el Foro Económico Mundial para conversar sobre las herramientas concretas que ellos han desarrollado para que las compras públicas de inteligencia artificial se hagan con altos estándares de transparencia, responsabilidad, entre otros. No solo vamos a conocer esas herramientas, sino también casos reales de uso en Dubái y Brasil. Para partir, esta mañana nos acompaña Tania Perich, directora de Chile Compra, que es el organismo público a cargo del sistema de compras públicas en Chile. Chile Compra es uno de los socios del proyecto de algoritmos éticos responsables y transparentes y será clave para la implementación de los estándares éticos como los que hoy vamos a discutir. Tania, muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Por favor, si puedes prender tu cámara y así contamos con tus palabras en este inicio de la conferencia.
Muchas gracias, María Paz. Bueno, nosotros también estamos muy contentos como Chile Compra de participar en este conversatorio en el que profundizaremos sobre esta caja de herramientas diseñada por el Foro Económico Mundial para la adquisición responsable de inteligencia artificial, en este caso y específicamente por el sector público, donde también conoceremos estas experiencias que estamos bien ansiosos por escuchar, ¿no? En la aplicación práctica realizadas tanto por Brasil como por Dubái. El proyecto Algoritmos Éticos, Responsables y Transparentes, en el que como institución hoy estamos participando, nos parece que es una experiencia inédita en Chile que busca instalar capacidades y estándares para incorporar consideraciones éticas, por una parte, en la compra y utilización de inteligencia artificial y algoritmos de decisión automatizada en agencias estatales, y por otra, en la formulación y desarrollo de estas soluciones por parte de los distintos proveedores tecnológicos. Agradecemos, por supuesto, a la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez y al Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo a través de su laboratorio de innovación BitLab por el trabajo colaborativo en esta alianza estratégica en la que queremos promover la aplicación, como decíamos, ética y responsable de la inteligencia artificial en las compras públicas de nuestro país. A través de la plataforma de compras públicas, mercadopublico.cl, que administramos nosotros como Chile Compra, cada institución en Chile realiza de forma autónoma y responsable sus adquisiciones, convocando electrónicamente a más de 115.000 proveedores al año, y estos proveedores a su vez participan de forma transparente en estas ventas. En esta plataforma, donde los organismos del gobierno central, como sus servicios y ministerios, también hospitales, municipios, universidades y distintas ramas de las Fuerzas Armadas, efectúan a diario y en línea sus compras. Solo como algunos números referenciales, durante el año 2020 tuvimos más de 1.600.000 órdenes de compra y representaron más de 12.600 millones de dólares. Sin duda, el Estado es un gran comprador y desde ahí tiene la posibilidad de influir en el mercado tecnológico para la incorporación de estándares éticos dentro de las bases de licitación de los servicios de datos y en general, y en particular la inteligencia artificial. Estamos conscientes de la importancia que a través de nuestros organismos y agencias se utilicen los sistemas automatizados o semiautomatizados de manera responsable, aprovechando así todas las oportunidades que el uso de datos nos abre para resolver problemas que pueden ser de mayor o menor complejidad, pero que hoy afectan a los ciudadanos. Se trata de evitar que con el uso de la inteligencia artificial se puedan presentar algunas instancias de discriminación o falta de transparencia, por mencionar tan solo algunas dificultades que pueden surgir en torno a la utilización de esta. A través de este proyecto y en línea con la Política Nacional de Inteligencia Artificial, que como ustedes saben acaba de presentar el Gobierno de Chile, estamos apoyando la creación de principios y estándares éticos para los servicios del Estado. De hecho, ya hay 2 licitaciones de distintos servicios públicos chilenos que se están ejecutando con estos criterios y estamos iniciando hoy, en conjunto con ustedes, con la universidad y con el BID, la elaboración de bases tipo de licitación, donde se propondrán cláusulas y criterios estandarizados para este tipo de adquisiciones, recogiendo los lineamientos y herramientas internacionales al respecto, pero a su vez adaptándolos a la realidad nacional. Por eso creemos que es tan valioso tener conversaciones como las que tendremos hoy. Compartir experiencias entre los distintos países, porque aún sabemos que nos queda mucho por hacer, construir y avanzar en cuanto a la ética de datos. Como Chile Compra y como país, podremos sacar importantes aprendizajes de los casos reales de compra que nos presentará tanto Uruguay y el Centro para la Cuarta Revolución Industrial de Brasil, en que se evaluaron los riesgos éticos usando las herramientas del World Economic Forum. Esperamos así poder incidir en la gestión de cambio para que los organismos del Estado consideren la gestión ética de datos dentro de sus estándares y requisitos de compra. Y por otro lado, promover la generación de oportunidades en las compras públicas para que las empresas tecnológicas desarrollen capacidades para incorporar estándares éticos en su provisión de algoritmos de decisión automatizada e inteligencia artificial. Muchas gracias y esperamos que sea una gran jornada de intercambio para todos y todas.
Muchas gracias, Tania. Efectivamente, el Estado tiene un... estoy escuchando la traducción en inglés, no sé por qué, en español. Voy a apagar mi canal de traducción. Ahí está apagado. Efectivamente, Tania, rescato una cosa muy importante de lo que tú planteas. El Estado, con su gran poder comprador, tiene la capacidad de influir en un mercado, ¿no es cierto? Y en ese sentido lo que busca este proyecto es elevar los estándares de ese mercado. Y en ese sentido promover el bien público, ¿no es cierto? Promover el bienestar de los ciudadanos, y ahí yo creo que eso es lo interesante de ocupar este mecanismo, en este caso para, ¿no es cierto?, que la tecnología que ya está permeando muchos sectores de la sociedad se pueda, ¿no es cierto?, hacer este cambio en la forma en que se compra y que se implementa. Bueno, y para seguir con este programa, ya se nos suma, ya está con nosotros Hubert López. Hubert, if you can turn on your camera, del Centro para la Cuarta Revolución Industrial del Foro Económico Mundial. Hubert nos va a contar en qué consiste la caja de herramientas que se ha diseñado en el Foro Económico Mundial para una adquisición responsable de la inteligencia artificial por parte del sector público. Pero antes de eso, Hubert, just one moment, we're going to first see that the introductory video. Primero vamos a ver un video introductorio sobre esta iniciativa de WEF. Bueno, muchas gracias por ese video y ahora sí, Hubert, cuéntanos. Adelante.
Thank you, Maria, for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. So my name is Hubert Allopé. I'm part of the Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning platform of the World Economic Forum, based here in Switzerland, Geneva. And I'm very delighted to share with this great audience today some insights on the project that we call Unlocking Public Sector AI, that co-developed with multiple stakeholders this procurement in a box toolkit. So before deep diving into the project, I'd like to highlight the approach that we take, not only for this project, but that we take for all initiatives at the forum and on the AI machine learning platform, namely the multi-stakeholder approach, meaning to bring together all affected and decisive stakeholders to tackle global challenges and find solutions to the challenges that fit all. Governments, for example, to safeguard citizens from harms posed by AI while also exploiting their benefits. For businesses to accompany their deployment of AI in their digital transformation journey, and society to make sure this technology is beneficial and accessible to all. Quickly, I'd like to shed light on our network of centers for the fourth industrial revolution. As you can see, it spans around the globe, and this helps us not only to design and build initiatives around AI governance and AI for good, but also to scale them globally. And coming now to the project that Maria mentioned at the introduction, so Unlocking Public Sector AI, also known as AI Procurement in a Box. This project sought to tackle two challenges mainly. One was the lack of knowledge and confidence of public procurement officials to procure this general purpose technology, this new emerging technology. Another aspect or angle of this project was to leverage the previously mentioned buying power of the state to influence the development and procurement of AI in a responsible manner without necessarily needing hard regulation. In terms of timeline of this project, so this was a multi-stakeholder effort that was about a 1.5 year long collaboration. I'll come back to that in more detail in a second. So this procurement toolkit was launched in June 2020. It was piloted with governments of the UK, Kingdom of Bahrain, as well as the United Arab Emirates. We further scaled those guidelines with the US Department of Defense. And since winter/spring 2021, together with our partner, the Inter-American Development Bank, and part of their FAIRLAC initiative, we are scaling those guidelines of responsible AI throughout Latin America and Caribbean, and very delighted today to kickstart this and continue the effort by the Chilean government. So the methodology behind this procurement, responsible AI procurement toolkit was agile methodology that we use. So in 4 phases, we can categorize them in simple terms. So one was opportunity mapping, then the framework development, prototyping, testing with a lot of iterations, and then the scaling and adoption phase that we are in today. And so as previously mentioned, we have piloted those guidelines with the UK government, and the US agency, the UAE, Bahrain, Brazil, you'll hear about that later today, as well as Colombia. And currently Chile, as well as Japan, actually are investigating those guidelines to implement or incorporate them in the procurement processes. We have also lined up governments from Rwanda, Israel, Azerbaijan, Saudi Arabia, and India, just to mention a few, that are keen to deep dive into the guidelines and exploit their potential. So also part of this agile methodology was really a bottom-up approach. So as mentioned, this was a multi-stakeholder effort with about 80 participants. So from the public sector, UK, very much leading the effort was UAE. Then we had Deloitte, Salesforce, or Splunk, just to mention a few, and academics involved in the process. And so the starting point was really to investigate user needs and pain points. Here I cut out a few from the interviews that we had and scoping meetings. One, as a policy official, I need to know who is providing sustainable and responsible AI solutions so that I can make informed decisions about pre-market engagement. Or if we take the startup view, I need to, without much effort, find and apply for AI contracts so that I'm able to say my solutions effectively to the government. So we bucketed the different user needs and pain points basically into 5 categories and really took into account the needs and pain points from the public sector primarily, but also the private sector as the supplier of the solution. So if we deep dive, for example, to skills and knowledge, often we heard public officials saying there's a lack of awareness and understanding of ethical considerations. On the flip side, private sector often said, well, we have a lack of understanding of the workings of government procurement processes. Another aspect, if we look at culture, was from the public sector side, the lack of knowledge of potential new innovative players, always or at the end, often seeking known suppliers from previous contracts. From the private sector, on the other hand, there was a tendency or is a tendency not to see the government as a viable customer. So with this toolkit, we try to tackle those challenges, and very happy today to see very interesting and positive use cases with those guidelines. So this slide basically shows the toolkit as a whole. So we have 5 pieces and more to come. So one is a project overview, which really lays out the holistic picture of the project. And then we have the procurement guidelines that we call them here as a core with its workbook. And I'll zoom in a second. We'll also attach a white paper around challenges and opportunities during the implementation phase of different governments, as well as a deep dive into the case study of the UK, which builds on the challenges and opportunities as well. For 2022, we'll extend those case studies, and you'll hear from Brazil in a second, but we'll also hope to extend those guidelines and toolkits throughout the procurement process. So if we zoom into the core outputs of this toolkit, and by the way, those guidelines and workbook were recently translated into Spanish together with IDB and our center in Colombia spearheading that effort. And in a nutshell, so those guidelines, those are 10 guidelines that we co-designed with this diverse set of stakeholders, are recommendations for public procurement officials to procure AI solutions in a transparent and accountable manner, as well as identify specific gaps there are today in the procurement process to accommodate the procurement of emerging technologies such as AI. And with that, also to create or support public trust, and also to increase incentives for public adoption of AI when useful. The workbook in a nutshell puts those guidelines into practice. So it's a very practical white paper or workbook to help governments navigate those guidelines and implement those in their processes where it makes sense for the respective government. The intended users of those guidelines and workbooks are laid out below on this slide. So policy officials, procurement officials, commercial teams in government, as well as chief data information technology innovation officers, and businesses, of course, who want to provide AI solutions to the public sector. So here again, the overview of different components of this AI procurement toolkit. I will spare you to go through the 10 guidelines that are really unpacked in the workbook in very much detail. But I'd like to highlight 2 or 3 of those principles to give you a flavor of the content and the direction in which this goes. So one, and this can also be applied to other emerging technologies apart from AI. So is the use procurement processes that focus not on prescribing a specific solution, but rather on outlining problems and opportunities and allow room for iteration. So this basically means to move away from specific solutions-based procurement to challenge-based or problem-based procurement to unlock the potential to attract innovative players or solutions that weren't think of before. Another one, if you look at the third guideline, is to align your procurement with relevant existing governmental strategies and contribute to their further improvement. So also to align the procurement process with existing relevant or related policies, etc., such as if your country or government has an AI national strategy or regulations on data or privacy, that those are embedded in the procurement process. Last but not least, and this I believe is quite an important principle, is to work with a diverse and multidisciplinary team. So really have a holistic team throughout the procurement process to make sure all relevant expertise is gathered to ensure responsible procurement of AI solutions. Just to share a few words on the workbook. So what you can find in there are, again, as said, so the instructions, like an instruction manual for the different guidelines on how to implement those. You can find detailed case studies, but also some risk assessment and impact assessment tools, as well as evaluation of best practices, which will ultimately help to feed the revamped or revised RFP for AI technology solution procurement. And last but not least, there are also some templates included that are hyperlinked in this workbook, which is off-the-shelf material to facilitate workshops to kickstart discussion on revising procurement processes for AI solutions. And on that note, and this is also part of the challenges and opportunities white paper that I mentioned earlier, also this includes some feedback from the different pilot that we had. So also that alignment across our different pilot partners, that it's a good starting point to have those workshops to kickstart the conversation and revamp of procurement processes. And challenges and opportunities were distilled in 3 or 4 categories or pillars. One around data, so meaning access, but also quality of data and sharing of data across government agencies. People, so not only talent, but also leadership is often or was often required in the different procurement initiatives around AI, as well as a last pillar on procurement and ethics. So how to action on ethics such as transparency, accountability, etc., was at the same time a challenge, but also an opportunity to revise procurement processes and make sure those are embedded in the final decision and RFP draft. So we conducted those pilot workshops with the UK, as mentioned, the UAE and Bahrain. So I hope that gave you a good overview of the Procurement in a Box toolkit, and look forward to the rest of the day today, and also to see how this toolkit was used in practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hubert, for that presentation. And I really liked how, developing the toolkit itself was an innovation process and incorporating feedback, agile methodologies. That I think that's really great. And now we're very excited to hear about our panelists who will share what it meant to implement this with public agencies in different countries. So we will begin today with the projects from Brazil. We have with us Clara Langevan. She's the project lead on artificial intelligence and machine learning from the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in Brazil. Welcome, Clara. And also joining Clara for the Q&A that's happening later is Rafael Facio. Rafael is the government fellow for the World Economic Forum and state attorney at the Sao Paulo state government. So he's also a public servant. So we'll have Rafael join Clara for the questions. And welcome, thank you so much for being here. And for any questions that you may have for Clara, we're going to take them after the presentation. So please use the Q&A tool. Las preguntas, como decía, las vamos a recibir por la herramienta de preguntas y respuestas una vez que termine la presentación de Clara. Así que les agradezco que puedan hacer las preguntas por ese medio. Tenemos a Natalia González, Fellow del Foro Económico Mundial, que va a estar revisando las preguntas para poder hacerlas luego a los panelistas. Go ahead, Clara.
Thank you so much, Maria Paz, and welcome everyone. I'm excited to be able to present the work that we've been doing in Brazil to you all. Just 1 second as I put my presentation on the screen. So my name is Clara Langevin. I'm the project lead for C4IR Brazil's AI machine learning platform. As Hubert recently pointed out, the C4IR network has affiliate centers in different places in the world. The Brazilian one is about a year old. We're an initiative between the World Economic Forum, the federal government of Brazil, the state government of Sao Paulo, and 6 private sector companies. So today I'm going to present a little bit about what we're doing in Brazil, both what we're doing in terms of products, in terms of publications, and our 2 pilots, going deep into depth with our pilot with the Metrô de São Paulo, which talks a little bit more about the actual procurement process. So as, just 1 second, I think I'm having some technical difficulties here. All right, so as Hubert recently pointed out, AI Procurement in a Box is the World Economic Forum's practical guide on how to procure artificial intelligence in a way that is both innovative, effective, and ethical. Basically, what we're doing in Brazil is we're trying to adapt those 10 guidelines that Hubert just presented into the Brazilian context, using as our buffer our pilots with the Metrô de São Paulo, the São Paulo subway system, and the Hospital das Clínicas of the Medical School of the University of São Paulo, which is a large public research hospital. And so before I get into what exactly are these pilots, I'm going to contextualize exactly what we mean by our project. So we're currently working with 2 different deliverables. Our first deliverable, which is already almost published, which will be published in December of this year, is a toolkit specifically for Brazilian public sector servants. So basically, we're taking these 10 guidelines and we're trying to put them in context within Brazil, looking at Brazil's regulations, Brazil's procurement processes, and some of the major challenges that Brazilian public sector entities face when they're adopting artificial intelligence. So in order to do that, we have our 2 pilots, and then I'll go into the community of experts that we're really working with to make sure that these are contextualized. And then, as Hubert also mentioned, we're working with the World Economic Forum and the Inter-American Development Bank to have an extension of the international project, where we're looking at some of the case studies that have already been implemented around the world and teasing out some of the themes that perhaps need a little bit more description on. So looking at the make versus buy conundrum, some issues with technical maturity and data access. And so that's forthcoming, and fingers crossed will be in April of 2022. And so going back to the Brazilian project, one of our major focuses was creating a community that would really allow us to understand what are the challenges of procuring artificial intelligence in Brazil, and have them be a backbone of creating our own toolkit. So first we have our pilots, which I'll go into in depth in the next slide, but then we also have a community of experts, so which is about 57 different individuals. And here we're talking about regulators and people who are involved with the Court of Auditors, which is one of the main auditing branches for procurement processes. We have previous adapters, so people from different entities in the Brazilian public sector that have already adopted artificial intelligence. We have academia, and here we're talking about not just those that study AI and its use on a societal level, but also academic labs or university labs that create artificial intelligence and have had partnerships with government entities for the use of AI models within, say, the Brazilian judicial system. We're also counting on Brazil's very robust civil society organizations. So we're working with the Institute of Technology and Research of Rio de Janeiro, Transparency Brazil, and Article 19, among others. And then, of course, we have the private sector, which here is represented not just by major international companies such as AWS and IBM, but also smaller providers and startups. And then we also have a community of practice, which is made up of government entities that are thinking about procuring AI, but perhaps aren't quite ready yet to become a pilot or already publish an RFP. And so here we have various state governments, and basically we have a conversation with them to make sure that our guidelines really make sense. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our pilots. So first, I'm going to talk about the Hospital of the Clinics, or the Hospital das Clínicas, which, as I mentioned before, is one of the largest research hospitals in Latin America. And they have a really ambitious plan. They want to buy several different algorithms from both larger companies to startups and vet them in-house, retrain them, especially when we're talking about imported algorithms that probably need to be retrained to be suitable for the Brazilian context, as well as allow a data lake that would be as a sandbox for startups to test out their own modules. So basically, they want to do this so that they can later sell out or allocate out algorithms to the greater healthcare system, not just the hospital and its departments, but also clinics and other hospitals around São Paulo. So the hope is that this will lower developing costs. It will solve infrastructure gaps especially in terms of data governance and data access, and guarantee quality, since the hospital will be vetting and doing risk evaluations for all of these algorithms. So right now, this project isn't quite working on an RFP just yet. Basically, what we're studying with them as our pilot is all the previous work that they're doing to get to the point where they're ready to adopt artificial intelligence in terms of creating a data lake, having data anonymization procedures, and other things that are important for adopting artificial intelligence. And then the pilot that I'm going to speak the most about today is the São Paulo subway system. So basically, the São Paulo subway system, which is a very large subway system, knowing São Paulo, they're thinking about buying, or they're ready to buy, a monitoring system for their railway system. Basically, it's a project that will lower their costs. Knowing, as anybody who uses public transportation can know, having track maintenance while you're trying to get to work can be very annoying. And it's also an interesting project for us to test out Brazil's procurement system in terms of buying artificial intelligence, because it's a relatively low ethical risk project. We're not working with private data or personal data. So it's an interesting thing to see how can we judge algorithms within the Brazilian procurement process. And so I'm going to get a little bit more in depth about this project, starting with their problem. So the São Paulo subway system, which I believe is similar to the Santiago subway system, as it is a state-owned company, although with São Paulo, some of the lines are privatized, but here we're talking specifically about the lines that are still public, so the blue, the green, and the red. And so on a normal day, the system has about 3.7 million passengers. However, as everybody who is familiar with public transportation knows, it can be some issues in terms of railway services. So for example, nails can pop out of rails and stop a train. So this has been an issue for the subway of São Paulo. And in the last 4 years, there was a total of 1,840 minutes of interference on the track, which ended up jeopardizing the mobility of almost 500,000 passengers, which is quite a bit. So in order to help solve this problem, the Metro was looking at innovative ways of real-time tracking, real-time maintenance of the tracking system. So basically, in order to do that, they decided to, first they settled that in order to solve this problem, they would need to have a general roadway inspection system that would be automated, online, and fast and efficient. So in order to find that, they decided to use a pre-commercial procurement process known as Encomenda Tecnológica. So this is, as Hubert mentioned in the first directive or the first guideline of the World Economic Forum's work, it's important, especially when you're buying these complicated systems of automated decision-making, to look at processes of procurement that are for innovation. And so this is one of the ways that we're going through this. So basically, it's a problem-based and mission-oriented procedure that favors the development of an innovative service, product, or process, provided there is technological risk. So it really allows for there to be some sort of qualitative evaluation of the system, of the artificial intelligence system, and some conversations with prospective providers, which can be very interesting for such a complex project. And our task as C4I Brazil was to see how can we apply the World Economic Forum guidelines within this process of Encomenda Tecnológica. And an interesting thing, as many of you guys have already looked at the procurement guidelines, there's a lot of work on how do you prepare your entity to start the procurement process and what kind of information that you need to have in your RFP in terms of reference. And with this, with the Encomenda Tecnológica, we were really allowed to look into what sorts of information needed to be on the RFP. So there was a preliminary study. There also was a risk map that I'm going to talk into depth in the next slide, which allowed us to look at risk evaluations, in particular an algorithmic impact assessment, to be published along with the RFP. And then, of course, the process of the Encomenda Tecnológica brought in specialists to look at the risks associated with the use of this technology. And eventually the RFP will be published, I believe, at the end of November. And then there'll be a process of negotiation with the potential contractors until there will be a signed contract. And so it was interesting to work with the Metro de São Paulo. They also had a workshop, as you guys are having right now, and seeing how we could fit in which guidelines were the most relevant to their cause and how we could fit them in within the process that the Metro had chosen. And so obviously one of the most important things that we were trying to see if we could fit into the Metro's public procurement process, which is a part of the AI procurement in a box, especially in the workbook for public sector entities, was the risk evaluation. And we decided to use an algorithmic impact assessment, which is a more elaborate form of evaluating risk for projects that use artificial intelligence. The gold standard for this kind of project is, or for this kind of mechanism, is Canada's algorithmic impact assessment, which is provided for in their directive on automated decision-making. And basically it has, I think, 86 different questions that look at the types of data that you're using, what sector are you using your algorithm in it? Is it one that has issues with public scrutiny, such as healthcare or public security, and how your own entity is prepared to mitigate any risk that can arise from the use of an algorithm within your entity. So they have, basically they give a level of risk for each kind of algorithm. So you have the first, which is if you have impacts that are reversible or brief, until the level 4, where you have irreversible and perpetual. And because we were wary of creating more bureaucratic limits for Brazilian public sector entities, we looked at practices that were already existent within Brazil's public procurement process to see if we could embed this kind of risk assessment within existing procurement processes. And the Encomenda Tecnológica is one of the many procurement modules that has a risk matrix module. And it's this orange and red image here, where basically this is from the TCU, the auditing agency. And basically it looks at what kind of impact a risk might have on a project, what kind of actions that an entity has to take to manage that risk, and what's the probability of that risk coming. And so once we sat down with the Metro's team, we realized that many of the risks that we had identified through Canada's algorithmic impact assessment were also able to be put into this general risk matrix. And so this was a way that allowed us to be able to publish what the risks are within the procurement process, and allow the Metro to understand what exactly were the algorithmic risks associated with their project, so that they can have a more open negotiation with their potential vendor. And so this is quite exciting. The idea of an algorithmic risk assessment is actually already cited in Brazil's national AI strategy. It hasn't quite been defined exactly how it's going to be done, if it's going to be associated with Brazil's general data protection law, if there's going to be an entity that'll look forward. But for now, we found that this was a really great way to present algorithmic risk within the current Brazilian procurement process. And with that, I'm going to wrap up my conversation. I look forward to everybody's comments, to myself and Rafael. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Clara. That is so interesting, and so many parallels with Chile. You know, in the Chilean national AI strategy also has as one of the actions to do a risk stratification model, and to actually put together a table of stakeholders, a council of stakeholders, to discuss risk stratification. And I really think that your approach of just using a normal model, you know, like a regular already used risk model, is just a great approach, and it's so much easier for everybody to understand. So thank you. So now we're, but we'll leave that for the discussion later. And now we're going to go to our next panelist, which is Mariam Al-Muhairi. And we ask her to turn on her camera. Thank you, Mariam. And we thank Mariam for joining us. There's been a lot of technical issues and she's really worked with us to solve these issues. Mariam is the Senior Projects Manager at the Dubai Future Foundation. So she's joining us from all over the world, the other way around the world. So we're really thankful, Mariam. And I will be helping you share the presentation. So I will start to project, and then you just say, you just ask me to go to the next slide and I will oblige, okay?
Sure, great.
So let me start sharing my screen. Is everybody seeing my screen?
Yeah, I can see it. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, amazing. So yeah, thank you for today's conversation, and thank you everyone for listening. And again, thank you for all the help with the technical issues. I think what's interesting about that is it leads very well into the work we've been doing at the center here, because obviously a lot of it is looking at tech. So as Maria mentioned, my name is Mariam Al-Muhairi, and I head the UAE Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, as well as being a Senior Project Manager at the Dubai Future Foundation. And the UAE Center is a collaboration very similar to what Clara just mentioned, a collaboration from our side between Dubai Future Foundation, which is a Dubai government entity, and the World Economic Forum. So we were launched in January 2019, so we're coming up to our 3 years. And we were the first affiliate center in the network, which was very exciting for us. And we're very happy to see a number of other countries now joining and hopefully exchange more knowledge and learn through webinars like this. As you'll see, we have 3 main portfolios. We focus on AI, which we'll be talking about today, blockchain, and precision medicine. So if I can go to the next slide. Just to give you a bit of project background, and I think that people already went through this, and so there's no need to go into this in detail, but to maybe just to give you a bit of an understanding of why we went into this project and why we thought the procurement project was important. What we found, or maybe I'll go back even before that. So in 2017, we had the first Minister of State for Artificial Intelligence. This was seen as a major strategic priority for the country. We had a blockchain strategy before this, and there was a lot of focus on digitization across the country. But what that meant was that we wanted to have a particular office that was focusing on this. So we had an office before this called Smart Dubai, which was focused on the digital agenda for Dubai. But the Minister of AI's post was really to focus on the digital and particularly AI agenda for the country from a federal perspective. And one of the things that we found when we started to look into this work, and we worked very closely with his office, is that public sector specifically, when they were acquiring AI, and this was something that was being pushed from a national level, were really unsure of what they were acquiring. So when they were trying to find, say, AI for a chatbot, or AI to help out with operational efficiency, what they instead were procuring for, or how they were using their procurement guidelines, was very similar to how you procure an iPhone or how you procure your laptop or other software. There wasn't really an understanding that procuring for AI was something quite different, and all of the concerns that come with it, security concerns. Clara mentioned, algorithmic assessments, as well as the sustainability of the system. So we went into this project really thinking we need to come up with a new procurement approach for AI to support the public sector and to ensure that the procurement officials who were now a part of this journey with us really understood what they were procuring for, and then how to assess it kind of post the RFP process and post suppliers submitting their proposals. So we can go to the next slide. Maybe we can shift through the guidelines since I think they've already been touched upon.
Yes, if there's any specific one where you really had to focus, you can, because Hubert went over them kind of generally.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, from our side, sorry, because it's a bit small. I think we can keep going to the actual case with DEWA, that's fine. So what we did ahead of the, as Hira mentioned, this was initially worked on with the UK AI office, and then came kind of to the UAE and then to Bahrain afterwards. So we had a kind of week of workshops with a number of entities who were utilizing AI in their organization and suppliers. And I think what was really important about this is that we were putting together kind of a multi-stakeholder group where we had the people who would actually be providing the AI solution working with government officials who were acquiring this. And so this was kind of post the initial development of the guidelines with the forum. And we decided that we would put it into trial with the Dubai Electricity and Water Authority, which is basically the main utilities electricity authority here in Dubai. And the reason we picked DEWA specifically is actually they've been quite forward looking with AI already. They use a number of kind of digital solutions for the work that they do. And so we saw that they had a clear procurement process already in place for AI, but they were having a number of challenges with the kind of let's say the finalization of these processes. So this was something that we saw that could help them as well. So if we could, next slide. So as we mentioned, it started off as a workshop, and then we basically asked these different entities, including DEWA, to explain what their procurement processes were like, how were they acquiring AI at the moment, and what was kind of what were the challenges they were facing. So for many procurement officials, I don't know if this is just a UAE thing, but for us, one of the things that we have a lot of trouble with is the timeline of a procurement process. So we tend to drag our procurement processes on for 3 to 4 or 5 months. But with something like AI, which is constantly being able to be updated, any sort of digital solution, there's always something new coming out. It meant that companies or entities were acquiring certain solutions or agreeing to acquire certain solution, and by the time that they received it, it was already out of date. And this was really one of the big challenges that they had. Another big challenge, as I mentioned, was around upskilling, that the procurement officials were not really aware of what they were acquiring, and thus were kind of saying okay to certain RFPs, saying okay to certain certain suppliers, without really knowing whether the supplier was going to provide something of good quality. Another thing that we had, and this was briefly mentioned, I think by Clara as well, is that we have a very stringent data law, and what that data law entails, and this is going through its own changes at the moment, but entails that everything has to be here in the UAE. So basically data residency law. So everything has to be on a specific cloud here in the UAE. And this was also a struggle because we had suppliers submitting, but then suppliers didn't necessarily want to engage with the government entities afterwards because they weren't able, they either didn't want to set up here, or they didn't have the capacity or ability to set up here. So if we go to the next slide, what happened through the process is we asked them to take the guidelines. And so this for us is one of the most successful projects we've had. We asked them to take the guidelines after we went through this workshop, and to basically change their procurement process based on these guidelines. And what they were able to do is one, which is very exciting for us, and I think we'll see that in the next slide. Sorry, Maria, if we can move. So what they were able to do is actually shorten their procurement process, because they understood that there was a need for this to be something that moves rapidly because of obviously technology. But what they also found was that these were certain things that needed to come out of it. So they realized, which funnily enough, if you say it now, seems kind of obvious, but they realized there needed to be a clear definition of AI. When they were procuring AI kind of prior to this, there wasn't the understanding of whether, let's say, a chatbot that utilizes maybe a little bit of data input and output is AI or not. So there was a clear definition of it, and then a clear categorization that needed to be done. The change management goes back into the upskilling, as I mentioned. And then there was this argument, and I'd be very interested to hear what other people think about this in the call, but there was an argument whether we allowed the market, like basically the market, to decide who suppliers were. So we basically went out to market and found all and any suppliers, or if there needed to be a pre-approved list of suppliers. And actually DEWA, the Electricity Authority, decided there should be a pre-approved list. But there has been kind of a back and forth on this, because obviously that means that you may have suppliers that are, you know, helpful and you've kind of vetted them, but you may miss out on other companies, and then this means that it becomes kind of a monopolistic approach to it. So there's been arguments back and forth. One of the other things was around evaluation criteria, and this is something we actually spoke to the forum about afterwards, because we wanted there to also be kind of a second stage to the procurement work where there's clear evaluation criteria. And then again, this discussion around data and how do we deal with data residency. And this is, of course, a much larger, I think, legal discussion. We can just go to the next slide. And oh, that's it. So I think what I wanted to kind of conclude from this, and sorry, I rushed through that, but what I wanted to kind of conclude from this is that actually after this process and after this was put through and DEWA became kind of the trial entity, we refined the guidelines from DEWA's perspective. They put in a whole new RFP process. They put in their own evaluation criteria, and then developed kind of particular actually department just for AI procurement. They then brought in a group or a committee basically that assessed these RFPs. So there were people who were experts in the field in artificial intelligence assessing it. So it wasn't just the general kind of procurement officials. And I think why I say this is one of our most successful projects is because this then the guidelines and the work that came out of this and the new procurement process actually moved into federal policy. So our Minister for Artificial Intelligence then worked with this framework to develop their own federal procurement policy, which is now in place for procuring AI here in the UAE. So that was a very exciting thing for us. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions as well later on when we have the discussion.
Thank you so much, Mariam. That is so interesting to know that, you know, the UAE has now a policy on AI procurement as a country. That's and really interested in hearing more about the evaluation criteria, which has been a challenge for us here in Chile as well, as we are doing our first pilots. So welcome and thank you, everybody, Clara and Mariam, and now we have Rafael. So I was going to ask you, please, if you can turn on your cameras. So Clara and Rafael, and we will begin the panel discussion, which I am sure will have a lot of things to say. And so we're going to start with a question, and then we're going to move to the audience questions, which Natalia, the World Economic Forum Fellow, will help us with. And we'll start with a question of the Chilean team, you know, because we've been in Chile, we've been working on 2 RFPs in 2 different agencies, which are our partners, which is the Public Defender, Defensoría Penal Pública, and the FONASA, which is the National Health Insurance Fund, the Public Health Insurance Fund. And, you know, one of the questions that we're having, because, you know, one is justice and the other one is health insurance as a field, you know, policy domain. But then we would really want, as a project, we're going to end up with guidelines that are, you know, general. So how much of what you learn in a specific policy domain like transport in Brazil, or in a hospital, or in electricity and water supervision, how much of that can you actually apply to a different policy domain? How much of these lessons are not domain specific, but more general? And whoever wants to speak can start. Maybe Rafael?
Yes, thank you, Maria Paz. I'm happy to take this one. First of all, I'd like to express how thankful I am for being here, because I was previously a consultant for the Inter-American Development Bank. I have studied Chile Compra's innovation procurement guideline, and it's really nice to see that Chile Compra is moving forward AI procurement as well. So basically, when you're talking about domain-specific questions, there obviously are going to be some very specific points, right, that you basically will have to deal during the procurement process as well. Clara has mentioned, for example, some risk-specific domains within the algorithm impact assessment that obviously will have to be dealt by the procurement team. However, something that's really good, for example, here in Brazil, when you're talking about the Encomenda Tecnológica, which is our own version of pre-commercial innovation procurement procedure, is that we're having lessons that are not going to be restricted only for transportation, but the Encomenda Tecnológica can be used in a wide array for objects. For example, vaccines here in Brazil were purchased, for example, with AstraZeneca, using the Encomenda Tecnológica. So we obviously are going to face some context-specific challenges and context-specific guidelines and context-specific technical recommendations, but there are many lessons that we can learn from the process, and these lessons can be replicated and iterated in a wide array of objects and different types of AI solutions as well. So the main purpose here is not to get the subway of São Paulo the best predictive maintenance system, but to help the subway of São Paulo to do what's the most important thing: shape norms that reflect and can help and enable AI technologies to regain trust, which is something that when we take a look at literature, we always see a very negative context arising from bias and prejudice coming from the use of AI solutions in the public sector. So the main purpose of these pilots, Maria Paz, especially the one with the Hospital das Clínicas, which is a great, the largest hospital below the equator, is to get, privacy rights, data protection set, because all these are important prerequisites that are not specific, again, to the context, but can portray different and very valuable lessons for other use cases as well.
Rafael, Mariam, I don't know if you want to jump in regarding lessons that you feel you can apply to other policy domains.
Of course, no. I think it's a great point, because as you rightfully mentioned, I mean, there are certain things that are very specific to the electricity and the water, I think, sector that, when you talk about operational efficiency, that's very specific to, I don't know, assessing, how much electricity is used, water wastage, things like that. I mean, obviously, that seems like it's super specific to that sector, and yet the same sort of, let's say, algorithms that you're putting in place to assess that or to think about that, you can probably use in another sector. So when we were doing this, even though it started off as a utilities procurement policy or a procurement approach, it turned into a much wider, in a way, more vague, let's say, to begin with, kind of federal policy that then could encompass a number of sectors. But what we did find, I think that was quite interesting about this is less the question around whether it could be used in several domains, but more, again, the question around how do we assess the companies then? And how do we, and again, whether this is a question of the companies being, do we take all companies from market, or is it pre-approved suppliers? And really the reason I come back to this is because this was a really big thing that was argued about back and forth, because there was this, as you rightfully mentioned, Rafael mentioned, trust. There was this worry of, can we trust all of the companies that are providing, these solutions, and how do we ensure that they work for the different sectors, and how do we ensure that's part of the policy? So yes, I think the answer is you can definitely use the policy for cross sectors, but I think, of course, when it comes to the specifics of things like companies and then what you're evaluating, perhaps it will then be different.
Yeah, the challenge of evaluating companies is definitely a challenge we're seeing here as well. How do you write those evaluation criteria if there's not the expertise of AI within the public agency? How do you know that that company is, good enough for what you want? that's a really big challenge. And I do think that challenge is over all policy domains, because there could always be some expertise of like the specific industry, but then there's just this general kind of, do they have the technical capacity to create these algorithms that will, and how do I actually write this criteria and give them points so I can choose the best one that applies. So that's a big challenge, and maybe we can come back to that later. But Clara, I don't know if you want to mention something around generalizing lessons from specific cases.
Sure, and I think Hafaya and Mariam spoke well about how some of these lessons learned specifically from the AI procurement project can be sourced out to different contexts. But then, as you mentioned, like when you're working in a specific sector and perhaps your public sector team doesn't have the expertise, how do you incorporate that in? I think it's the 7th guideline that discusses about how you should create your own internal team. And I think that's exactly where you get into what's important about working in different contexts. Yes, there are some things that are going to be the same, such as issues with data access and data governance, such as looking at risks. And then of course, each different sector has a different proportionality of risks. Obviously, the use of artificial intelligence in public security is much higher than the use of artificial intelligence in the metro system. But of course, knowing the specifics of each of these systems is extremely important. So for example, with the Metro, we've been working with a researcher from the Institute of Technological Research here at the University of Sao Paulo that's helped us sort of understand the context of how this is going to be used so that we can better help the Metro in Sao Paulo.
Thank you, Clara. So I'm going to ask Natalia González Alarcón, from the fellow of the World Economic Forum, to join us now as my co-moderator, and she's going to share with us the questions from the audience. Go ahead, Natalia.
Thank you, Maria Paz. Yes, and if anyone wants to add another question from the conversation we're having, the Q&A is still open for you to write it down in that space. So I would like to start with a question about something that Marian mentioned that was the first step for them, and it was to define what is AI and what is not. And here someone asked how did you reach at like the final definition of what is AI, and if you define what is automatic and semi-automatic decision systems, and what were the difference between those different systems?
Sure. So I have to, I think, start off by saying I'm not an AI expert as much as I would like to be. But honestly, it's still a debate, which is, I know, not a helpful answer, but it's the truth. I think what we found most helpful was the categorization versus the definition itself. So, you could categorize it into, is this like machine learning? Is this RPA? Is this NLP? And then by having these sort of things kind of set out as types, let's say, then whatever the supplier was providing, they kind of put into one of these categories. Again, as I say, I'm not an AI expert, so I might have completely butchered what these different sections are. But what was done when they were discussed was categorizing it, and then based on that, they were able to assess if it was AI or not. What's been happening now, though, within the AI office? So that was when we first started the project. What's been happening now within the AI office in the UAE is they actually have a seal. Kind of like a certificate or a seal of approval, where they have their own experts that go through a company's product. They also go through a company's portfolio, I think background and things like that. And they provide this seal or this kind of quality assurance, kind of like you'd have with other products, that this is artificial intelligence and can be licensed as an artificial intelligence company. So that's actually helped, I think, other government entities with this question around categorization or definition, because they now have the formal body saying that this is AI and thus you can use it as such. I hope that was helpful.
Comment to that, Natalia. In Chile, the scope of our project is not just AI. So we're talking about automated decision-making systems or semi-automated, because there's a lot of problems that public agencies have that can be solved not with AI. And the other simple automated systems, that process data but don't do machine learning, can work. And so at least in our project, the scope for the guidelines is not going to be AI. It's going to be automated systems, but we still had a lot of issues with the naming, the definition. You know, this, even just saying that is really hard, because then anything could be an automated system. And so this is very challenging.
Can I just add to that, because this actually, not so much with AI, but this was an issue we had with blockchain. So as I mentioned, our first kind of government strategy was around blockchain, and because there was this drive from the government, so we're quite a top-down country, if you know about us. So because there was this drive from government, all of these government entities were like, okay, we have to adopt blockchain immediately, you know, and that was great because it was very helpful for efficiency. But what we found is that you don't need to use blockchain for everything, right? And so we learned that through trial. And I think when we got to AI, then it was maybe less, you know, or maybe we were less gung-ho because we'd kind of gone through this process with blockchain. So you're absolutely right that it kind of, with certain technology is not always the answer, and sometimes it's much more simple.
Natalia.
I'm sorry, if I may add to this question, only to say that the same thing that Maria Paz has mentioned, and Mariam as well, we see it in Brazil. I'm a member of the Office of the Attorney General, and I usually work as the lead counsel for intellectual property and innovation projects. And sometimes the urge to use or name a project as an AI project is bigger than the problem they are trying to solve. Sometimes the people tend to be attached to this hot topics such as AI and blockchain, and they forget the problem they're solving. So this is something that's really worth mentioning, that we should really get to know in depth the problem that we're trying to solve, because sometimes this is true throughout Latin America and Europe as well. Many use cases of innovation in general from the public sector are generally incremental innovation, not so much hard science-based challenges. And this is natural. So we should stick to the problem if we're going to try, or at least focus on innovation procedures to deploy, for example, artificial intelligence or any other innovation-based objects.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's one of the main challenges that we have when we want to speak about AI projects, no, and an AI solution. And to get to that, one of the main problems that we have, or main challenges as well, is the data. So we have one question related to that, and how do you think, or what are the legal guarantees that we can possibly use when thinking about the security risk that the data of in the case of the hospital or the healthcare, in a healthcare project, when you're using personal data and sensitive data, how to define what are the legal guarantees to protect the data you're using for a project, and how to include that in the procurement process, of course.
Well, if I may, maybe Clara can share extra details about Hospital das Clínicas project afterwards. But Brazil has recently transitioned from a very broad constitution and civil code based system of data protection to a very extensive regulation, our own version of the GPDR, which is Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados. To the ones who speak Spanish, it's really straightforward to get. And this, our own version, our Brazilian GPDR, provides extensive controls and safeguards and governance mechanisms. For example, Brazil has created an agency. They're still, starting to add some normative instructions and their own regulations about data protection. But it's a very robust system, and it's not yet completely functional because the law is really recent. It came into force in 2018, and it started to be enforced about the mid of 2020. So this system is not complete. However, there are many guidelines and recommendations, and specifically procedures related to consent that we should be following. For example, to the specific needs for the hospital, there are specific exemptions in the law. You find this in American and GPDR and other data protection regulations around the globe, in which they exempt the need to get a specific consent from every citizen if you're going to treat, for example, data for public purposes such as health systems. So you can obviously justify, and you have to do so, using the some of the provisions that our GPDR has, but it's also very important to treat data looking at the complete life cycle. For example, we tend to be very focused on the data collection moment, but there are also, for example, we're talking about health issues. So, and Brazil is a massive federation. So you keep sharing data and transferring data from federal to state and municipal level health institutes. So this is very messy and tricky, and we should be compliant from day one. So even in the RFP, even in the second, for example, we're setting responsibilities and even civil liability, for example, it is very important to see which are, for example, the responsibilities that the public might have as the data controller, and the private, your private supplier will have as the private operator. We have these categories in Brazil, which pretty follow the general categories in GPDR. But basically, Natalia, we have now this robust system, but since it's still incomplete, we are trying to be overzealous about data protection. So we're treating it from day one on RFP as well.
And I can jump in and say a little bit more about the project, which is exactly the idea of being overzealous with data protection. One of their major points with the data lake that they're creating to train algorithms is how are they going to anonymize data in a way that it can be used by other actors. And so they're looking at different ways of anonymizing data to ensure that it can't be re-identified. And so that's one of their main priorities. And also, as Rafael mentioned, the idea of data sharing between institutions. They're first trying to figure out how they're going to share data between the 10 departments, research departments that are already inside of the hospital, and what would be the best way to do that in terms of data governance, and to make sure that each department is comfortable with that, because sometimes the culture as well of making sure that that you have control over the data that your institution produces is also an issue. And then, as Rafael mentioned, the transfer between different entities in government is also something that's playing out with this pilot. And also another project associated with C4IR Brazil, which on our data policy platform, is the transfer of health data between municipal institutions. So looking at clinics and emergency services that are by the city of São Paulo to the Hospital das Clínicas and other entities that are owned by the state. And so how exactly will that happen? And then that kind of fits into some of the other conversations that the country is having about the national Connect SUS data system and exactly how that's going to happen.
Thank you very much. And as a quick follow-up question that they also ask in the chat is how to avoid discrimination for people who don't want to give consent to use their personal data in the process. Is there any practice, any experience that you have done with this kind of situation?
Well, just to share quick insight about this. For example, since we're talking about highly sensitive health data, but in this Hospital das Clínicas big projects, we can, as I mentioned, justify data treatment under the exemptions of having a specific consent of each citizen. So they are not required to give consent to each specific health treatment because this is based in broader public policy. That's a clear exemption under Brazilian law. And this is why we are justifying the use cases that using this provision. However, Natalia, I can tell you that in many other use cases which are not in our project, and projects, for example, they are ongoing until in the state, for example, here in São Paulo, getting the consent is sometimes the most tricky part, because people, obviously, legislation allows people to revoke consent if they will, and this data collection, this consent administration is something that we still lack specific regulations from this agency, which is with they have like 10 months of existence. So they haven't been through this yet. So this is something very tricky, and many projects which require consent or they cannot be based on one of the exemptions in our specific law. Sometimes they are, they get a bit clumsy because they they can't be able to move forward under this uncertainty about data protection requirements.
Thank you very much. Maria Paz, you will.
I was just wondering that did anybody, and going back to the audience question about discrimination, there are methods that you could use to, mitigate any bias in the data if you're creating, for example, a diagnostic algorithm to make sure that it is representative, for example, for all types of population in Brazil. I'm not sure if for example, in the evaluation criteria of the model, you are considering, for example, fairness metrics, which could, you can address discrimination not through consent, but through through these other ways. I'm not sure if you're using any other way.
And in addition to this, Maria Paz, other than the evaluation criteria, it's very important to consider during the contract execution, the presence of this human in the loop, which is sometimes having the possibility of having an, let's say, an analog data treatment in parallel with the system. So in order you can get like not only updated feedback and updated data to feed correctly the algorithm, but to see if the algorithm outputs are addressing correctly this bias and prejudice stuff. So it's really, this human in the loop has extensive literature pointing out the advantage of this approach. However, there is still very recent literature stating that this type of approach also has risks, and we should really take care of those during the contract execution phase as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it's not a straightforward answer, but there are a lot of strategies and methods that we need to explore for that. Just quick last question is about the role of the academia in this conversation, and in general, how to include other sectors in this process and this conversation to change or to improve the procurement process for AI. I don't know, Marian, if you want to share some thought.
So, I mean, as I mentioned, when we started this procurement project, one of the things we had was this workshop, which was, multi-stakeholder workshop, which also included people from academia. I think at the time we were very focused on kind of the development of the guidelines, and so they were kind of coming in as experts in the field versus perhaps becoming kind of a larger part of this process. But I think what we're talking about now in terms of bias and discrimination is something that is also a second phase of this project that I mentioned around the seal or the certification around companies. We're also looking at kind of audit processes for algorithms. So once you have a company in place and you've been utilizing that company for a certain period of time, the same way that we have these financial audits that happen every year for companies, you need to start thinking about how you're going to audit your algorithms. And so this is something the AI office is also looking to put in place. So I think that's where we will see a number of sectors kind of come together and work on this, because this is something that, again, is going to be key to all sectors, including, I think, academia, if we're using it, for example, for grading education. I don't know. That was me throwing a random idea.
Yeah. No. That's a conversation that we actually are having with many countries in the region as well. So yes, I don't know if Rafael or Clara wants to comment something before we close the panel, or Maria Paz.
We're very short on time now, so if it is, it's just 10 seconds. No? Okay, thank you. So I would really, I would really love to continue this conversation, and I will send each of you some questions, because we are all involved, in actually making this happen in our own countries. So this is such an exciting conversation for us to learn among each other. And I thank you for participating. Thanks to the World Economic Forum, to Natalia, to Hubert, and to all the team that's behind them for facilitating this opportunity and for us being able to share international experiences. So now I invite Gabriela Lasso. So ahora voy a hablar en español. Y para terminar este conversatorio, pido que Gabriela Lasso, jefa de la División de Estudios e Inteligencia de Negocios de Chile Compra, se sume. Como les contaba al inicio, Chile Compra es el organismo público a cargo del sistema de compras públicas del país y es una de las instituciones socias del proyecto Algoritmos Éticos, Responsables y Transparentes. Hola Gabriela, bienvenida.
Hola a todos.
Después de las experiencias que hemos conocido hoy, ¿qué aprendizajes destacarías que crees que puedan servirle a Chile Compra y en general a los organismos públicos que compran tanto en Chile, en América Latina, como para implementar estos estándares éticos?
Bueno, creo que hoy día hemos podido dar cuenta de la importancia de tener herramientas estandarizadas que apoyen la contratación. Dentro de Chile hay interés, hay algunos organismos del Estado que ya han mostrado disposición para adquirir algoritmos éticos, por eso que en Chile Compra ya nos estamos preparando para ayudar en la contratación de este servicio como nuevo tipo de compra pública, con medios y herramientas que a las instituciones les sirvan para facilitar el proceso. Por ejemplo, actualmente estamos apoyando la contratación de 2 algoritmos éticos para 2 organismos públicos distintos, que ya mencionaron. Sus licitaciones fueron publicadas en nuestro sitio de compras públicas, Mercado Público, donde muchas empresas proveedoras tienen la opción de revisar las bases de licitación y postular libremente. Estas bases de licitación tienen incluida la necesidad de agregar la componente ética a sus desarrollos, y además estamos trabajando en construir 2 herramientas de apoyo, una base tipo y una directiva de compras, para ayudar a futuros servicios que también deseen contratar de manera sencilla un algoritmo ético para resolver sus problemas.
Y en ese sentido, ¿cómo? A mí me interesó mucho lo que planteaban con respecto al sector privado, ¿no es cierto? Que Chile Compra, aquí tenemos que avanzar para que más servicios públicos adopten el lineamiento, que ahí las herramientas que tú mencionas son muy útiles, pero también Chile Compra hace mucho trabajo con los proveedores, ¿no es cierto? Entonces, ¿cómo podemos, qué ingredientes crees que tú van a ser claves en el fondo para que avancemos con estos lineamientos una vez que los podamos publicar el próximo año?
Yo creo que aquí lo más importante es primero setear el ejemplo y también fomentar el interés y por sobre todo construir la confianza de las instituciones en estas contrataciones. Por ejemplo, en las compras públicas de Chile, si bien se compran desarrollos, hoy día se están haciendo desarrollos de software clásicos, como contratar, por ejemplo, el desarrollo de una página web, o incluso hay algunos que también contratan algoritmos, pero aún no se habla mucho de la componente ética. De hecho, no son pocos los que tienen alguna resistencia o una latencia y uso de los datos de las personas. En su momento, por ejemplo, fue la desconfianza hacia la nube. Muchas instituciones tenían miedo de subirse a la nube porque sentían que los datos dejaban de ser de ellos, que andaban por ahí sueltos afuera y perdían su gobernanza. Hoy en día lo de la nube ya no es tema, y muchos han visto cómo otras compañías disfrutan de los beneficios de la nube, y por tanto los motiva a aplicarlo a ellos también. Entonces, estos mismos ejemplos que se aplican en las compras públicas pueden ser incluso copiados también por empresas privadas que ven acá éxito en estas medidas. Por eso es tan importante tener estos ejemplos como los que vimos hoy, porque eso crea confianza y motiva a otros organismos a participar. Y finalmente también destacaría el hecho de tener leyes y políticas que respalden estas contrataciones, que hay algunos que ya mencionaron en sus preguntas, la preocupación por tener respaldos legales, o sea, hay discriminación, alguien que quiera comportarse distinto. En Chile, por ejemplo, ya tenemos algunas leyes y políticas que rigen el uso de estos datos de las personas, y últimamente ha habido preocupación por incorporar la variable ética. Por ejemplo, tenemos la Ley de Protección de la Vida Privada, que norma sobre la utilización de los datos personales, y también la primera Política Nacional de Inteligencia Artificial, impulsada por el Ministerio de Ciencia de Chile. En esta política se habla acerca de cómo empoderar a las personas en el uso y desarrollo de herramientas de inteligencia artificial, pero a la vez estar conscientes de sus consecuencias legales, éticas y sociales. El hecho de que haya un respaldo legal y político es muy importante porque hace que las instituciones se sientan más confiadas de hacer las implementaciones y también es una protección hacia las personas. Al final, ninguna empresa está interesada en ser cuestionada públicamente por cómo usa los datos, como fue, por ejemplo, el caso de Cambridge Analytica y los datos de Facebook, que fueron usados en su momento para influenciar las votaciones en Estados Unidos. Así que es importante que a través de las políticas también se guíe a las personas las mejores prácticas de uso dentro de un marco regulatorio, pero sin tener que llegar a prohibir su uso.
Muchas gracias, Gabriela. Efectivamente, en Chile, el próximo año ya estamos en marcha con 2 pilotos, uno en la Defensoría Penal Pública y otro en el Fondo Nacional de Salud, FONASA, y esperamos el próximo año hacer un evento como este, pero donde sea la Defensoría Penal, FONASA y Chile Compra, todos contando de las lecciones de este proceso, también para que ya cuando nosotros hayamos vivido todo, completado este proceso, podamos compartir con el mundo y con nuestros socios del Foro Económico Mundial nuestras experiencias. Muchas gracias, Gabriela, por quedarte hasta el final con nosotros, a Chile Compra por ser parte de este encuentro y al BitLab, el Laboratorio de Innovación Pública del Banco Interamericano del Desarrollo, y a la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, desde donde estamos liderando el proyecto Algoritmos Éticos, con participación de todas las escuelas, la Facultad de Ingeniería y Ciencias, la Facultad de Artes Liberales, la Escuela de Comunicaciones y Periodismo y por supuesto la Escuela de Gobierno. Y a todos ustedes que hoy día se sumaron. Ahora vamos a cerrar con un pequeño video de 1 minuto para contarles más del proyecto. Buenas tardes.
El proyecto Algoritmos Éticos, Responsables y Transparentes reúne a múltiples actores para promover la gestión ética de los datos y así prevenir esos riesgos. Este es un proyecto inédito en Chile que convoca al mundo público, al sector privado, a la academia y a toda la sociedad a formar alianzas, a trabajar coordinados y a participar de jornadas de capacitación y de reflexión. Juntos vamos a desarrollar y aprobar guías para el sistema de compras públicas chileno, de manera de empujar tanto al mercado como a los servicios estatales a marcar pauta ante una nueva forma de hacer las cosas, que más que tecnológica, es un desafío profundamente humano. Poner a las personas y al bien común al centro de la gestión de los datos es nuestra invitación.